An 8-year-old girl lies motionless on the floor. Her small body, frail and bruised, tells a story of suffering no child should endure. Her breathing is shallow. Her heartbeat fades. And the people responsible for her pain do nothing. When paramedics finally arrive, it is already too late. Internal bleeding. A ruptured intestine. Severe blunt force trauma. The doctors do everything they can, but her body has endured more than it could take. Her name was Rica Rountree. A bright, loving child with dreams of a future she would never see. This was not an accident. This was not a case of neglect. This was murder. 4 months, Rica had been living in a home filled with secrets, violence, and fear. She had been crying out for help in ways only a child can. Through bruises on her arms, through empty looks in the classroom, through silent, fearful obedience. But no one listened. No one saved her. This is not just the story of a child taken too soon. It is the story of failure, by those who should have protected her, by a system designed to intervene, by the very people she depended on for safety. Who allowed this to happen? Who ignored the warning signs? And how did one woman get away with torturing a child under the eyes of those who should have seen? This is the story of Rica Rountree. And it is time the world finally hears the truth. Before we continue, take a moment, subscribe to this channel. Join a community that refuses to look away. A community dedicated to uncovering the truth, spreading awareness, and making sure justice is never ignored. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's make sure the world remembers Rica Rountree. Because when we remember, we fight for change. And when we fight for change, we can save lives. Now let's begin. Before the bruises. Before the silent cries. Before the world knew her name in tragedy, Rica Rountree was just a little girl. A little girl who loved to laugh. A little girl who had dreams. A little girl who had a heart too big for the world that failed her. May 2010. A baby girl enters the world, full of life, full of promise. Her mother, Anne Rountree, remembers the moment she first held Rica in her arms. She was tiny, with big, curious eyes that seemed to soak in everything around her. Even then, it was as if she knew the world had something waiting for her. And it did. Rica wasn't just another little girl, she was special. From the time she could talk, Rica had a gift that made her stand out from every other child in the room. She could light up even the darkest of days. She had this way of sensing when someone was sad, when someone needed a hug, when someone just needed a little love. Most kids her age were still learning to express their own emotions, but Rica was already taking care of others. Her teachers noticed it right away. If a classmate was crying, Rica was the first to sit beside them. If someone was alone at recess, Rica would take their hand. If someone dropped their lunch tray, Rica would be the one on her knees picking it all up. She didn't hesitate. She didn't have to be told. It was just who she was. She had the kindest soul, one of her teachers would later say. It was like she was put on this earth to remind us what love really looks like. And maybe that's why what happened to her hurts so much. Because if anyone deserved love in return, it was Rica. She loved to sing. She loved to dance. She had this silly little way of scrunching up her nose when she laughed too hard. And when she laughed, really laughed, it was impossible not to smile with her. She wasn't just a child. She was a light. And that light? It should have never been dimmed. But behind that bright smile was a storm slowly building. And that storm had a name: custody. Her parents, Anne Rountree and Richard Rountree, had a complicated past. And in the middle of their battles was Rica. A little girl who just wanted to be loved. A little girl who just wanted to be safe. And Rountree knew something was wrong. She felt it. A mother's instinct is rarely wrong. But instincts don't hold up in court. Documents do. Evidence does. And according to the system, there wasn't enough. So, the judge made a decision. Rica would live with her father. At the time, it seemed like just another ruling. Just another legal battle between two parents who couldn't see eye to eye. But what no one realized, not the judge, not the attorneys, not even Rica herself, was that this decision would become a death sentence. Because waiting on the other side of that courtroom ruling was Cynthia Baker. A woman who had no biological connection to Rica. A woman who, in just a matter of months, would take away everything that made Rica special. Her joy, her innocence, and eventually, her life. What happened behind those closed doors was something no one, not even the strongest hearts, can prepare for. But what makes this story so unbearable isn't just how it ended. It's who it ended with. A little girl who was too full of love for a world that wasn't ready to protect her. And now, as we pull back the layers, one haunting question remains: how did we let this happen? Imagine a house where the walls don't echo with laughter but with screams. Where a child's footsteps are hesitant, measured, afraid to make a sound. Where bedtime isn't a safe retreat, it's a punishment. This was the home Rica Rountree was sent to. A house where love was just a word, and fear was a way of life. The moment Rica walked into that house, something changed. It wasn't home. It wasn't safe. It was a prison. And the warden? A woman named Cynthia Baker. Who was she? To the outside world, she was Richard Rountree's girlfriend, the woman he had chosen to build a life with. But behind closed doors, she was something far worse. A predator. A tyrant. A woman who took pleasure in cruelty, and who had found the perfect victim, an 8-year-old child with nowhere to run. Richard met Cynthia at a time when his life was unraveling. He needed control. She needed someone weaker than her to dominate. And together they created a world where Rica was no longer a child. She was a target. Neighbors would later describe Cynthia as cold, distant, a woman whose presence alone made others uncomfortable. But the darkness inside her was far greater than anyone could have imagined. At first, the signs were subtle. Rica stopped smiling as much. Stopped talking as much. Teachers noticed she wasn't raising her hand in class like she used to. She didn't play with her friends at recess. She didn't run, didn't skip, didn't twirl the way she once had. Then came the excuses. Rica started showing up to school with bruises. Her once bright eyes looked sunken, tired. She would sit quietly at her desk, hands folded as if afraid to take up too much space. When teachers asked what happened, she would mumble, "I fell. I ran into a door. I'm just clumsy." And yet something was off. Children fall all the time, but not like this. Not with bruises that looked like they came from fists. Not with marks on their arms that looked like someone had grabbed them too hard. Not with a fear in their eyes that told a story no child should ever have to tell. Then there was the weight loss. Rica's once round cheeks had started to hollow. She would stare at her lunch like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to eat it. Sometimes she would sneak food into her backpack, as if she wasn't sure when her next meal would come. And the most chilling sign of all? She stopped trying to speak up. She stopped looking for help. Because by then she had already learned, no one was coming. What does it take for a child to be saved? A phone call? A report? A concerned teacher? Rica had all of these. But none of them were enough. The Department of Children and Family Services had been called. Rica's mother, Ann Rountree, had pleaded with them, "Something is wrong. My daughter is not safe." But in the world of bureaucracy, words are just words. Without undeniable proof, there was nothing they could do. Nothing they would do. The caseworkers came. They checked the house. They asked questions. And then they left. They left Rica alone in a house where monsters didn't just exist in nightmares. They walked beside her in daylight. And with every ignored report, with every brushed aside concern, Rica learned a painful truth. No one was listening. No one was coming to save her. She was on her own. There is a moment in every tragedy where something could have changed. A moment where one decision, one action could have rewritten the story. For Rica, that moment came just weeks before her death. A final report was made. Another call. Another warning. This time, a teacher noticed something in Rica's eyes. Something empty. Something broken. And for the first time, Rica let the words slip out. Just a few. Just enough. "She hurts me." The report was sent. But by then it was too late. The system that was built to protect children like Rica didn't just fail her. It abandoned her. It handed her back to the people who saw her not as a child, but as an object. A burden. A punching bag. The next time the authorities would step into Rica's life would be when it was already over. The night Rica collapsed, she must have known. She must have known that this time, there would be no getting back up. This time the pain was different. This time the damage was done. She lay on the floor, her tiny body broken beyond repair. Her father was there. Cynthia Baker was there. And yet no one called for help. She was left to suffer. Left to fade away. Left to slip into unconsciousness while the people who did this to her went about their night like nothing had happened. By the time they finally called 911, it was only to save themselves. Not Rica. Because by then Rica was already slipping through their fingers. Her small body was rushed to the hospital, doctors fighting to keep her alive. But they were fighting against something much bigger than a single night of abuse. They were fighting against months and years of abuse. A lifetime of suffering in a house that was never a home. And in the end, they lost. Rica Rountree should have been saved. She should have been pulled from that house the first time a bruise appeared. The first time a report was made. The first time she looked at an adult with pleading, desperate eyes. But she wasn't. Instead, she was left in a home where monsters were real, where every day was a test of how much pain she could endure. Where love was something she had to beg for, and even then she never received it. This wasn't just one failure. It was failure upon failure. A system that saw the signs but didn't act. A world that heard her cries but didn't listen. A home that was meant to keep her safe but became the place that destroyed her. And now the only thing left is the question that will haunt everyone who hears her story. How did we let this happen? There is something uniquely horrifying about knowing that someone suffered, and no one stopped it. That the pain wasn't sudden, wasn't unexpected. That it happened slowly, deliberately, and in full view of those who could have intervened. Rica Rountree didn't just die, she was destroyed piece by piece over time. And the evidence? It's unbearable. 4 months, Rica endured a nightmare that no child should experience. But the worst part? We know exactly what happened. We don't have to imagine it. Because Cynthia Baker left behind something truly chilling. A proof? Evidence in the form of cell phone footage. Videos taken not out of remorse, not out of guilt, but out of sheer cruelty. Videos that documented Rica's suffering like a twisted trophy collection. And what they reveal is almost too much to bear. In one video, Rica is forced into a stress position. Kneeling, hands in the air, her small body trembling from exhaustion. The weight of her suffering pressing down moment by moment as Cynthia Baker watches. Stay like that, Baker's voice cuts through the silence. Rica obeys. She knows the consequences if she doesn't. In another video, she is kicked in the stomach. A sharp, calculated blow. Rica crumples forward, gasping for air. The pain must have been unimaginable, but the most haunting part? She doesn't scream. She doesn't cry. She barely reacts at all. Because by then Rica knew, tears wouldn't help. Nothing would. In yet another recording, Rica stands against the wall while Cynthia Baker berates her. The words aren't just cruel. They're meant to break her. You're stupid. You're worthless. No one cares about you. Rica, only 8 years old, stands there and absorbs it all. Because what else can she do? There is no escape. There is no refuge. There is only this. We often ask, how could no one have known? But the truth is people did know. They just did nothing. Richard Rountree, Rica's father, lived in that house. He saw the bruises. He saw the hunger in his daughter's eyes. He heard the insults, the beatings, the quiet sobs at night. And yet he did nothing. Maybe he was afraid of Cynthia Baker. Maybe he didn't care enough to stop her. Maybe he convinced himself it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But the reality remains, he let it happen. He watched as his own daughter suffered at the hands of the woman he chose to bring into their home. And then one day, it was too late to stop it. By January 2019, Rica's body had endured more than it could take. The malnourishment, the bruises, the kicks to her stomach. Her small frame was shutting down, but she was too afraid to tell anyone. She complained of stomach pain. Subtle at first but growing worse. Maybe she thought it was nothing. Maybe she was used to ignoring pain by then. Maybe deep down she already knew what was coming. That night Rica collapsed. She must have been terrified. Gasping for air. Holding her stomach. Knowing something was very, very wrong. And yet no one rushed to help her. Cynthia Baker was there. Richard Rountree was there. And what did they do? Nothing. She lay there, suffering in silence, while the people who did this to her continued with their night like she was just an afterthought. It wasn't until Rica was barely breathing that someone finally picked up the phone and dialed 911. The call itself is haunting. A voice, calm, detached, reports that Rica is unresponsive. No panic. No urgency. Just words rehearsed and cold. She just collapsed. Just collapsed. As if her body hadn't been breaking down for months. As if she hadn't been beaten, degraded, starved, tormented. As if this wasn't the inevitable end of a long and horrific story. By the time paramedics arrived, Rica was barely clinging to life. They rushed her to the hospital, the sirens slicing through the quiet night. Maybe in those final moments there was a flicker of hope. Maybe someone somewhere could undo the damage that had been done. But the damage was too great. The emergency room was a blur of motion. Doctors, nurses, machines. Rica was placed on the hospital bed, her body frail, her breathing shallow. They worked desperately, doing everything they could to save her. But there was one undeniable truth they all saw the moment they laid eyes on her. This child had been tortured. Bruises. Old and new. Bones that had healed improperly from past injuries. Signs of prolonged malnutrition. And the fatal blow, the trauma to her abdomen that had caused internal bleeding. They tried. They tried so hard. But in the end, the little girl who once twirled in the sunlight, who once had dreams bigger than her tiny frame, slipped away. At just 8 years old, Rica Rountree was gone. What were her last thoughts? Did she think of her mother, the one person who had fought so hard to save her? Did she wonder why no one stopped this? Did she still believe, even at the very end, that someone was coming? We will never know. What we do know is this: Rica should still be here. She should be running, laughing, growing up. She should be safe, surrounded by love, not pain. But instead, her story became another statistic. Another name on a growing list of children failed by the system, by the people around them, by the very ones meant to protect them. And now, as the world learns the truth, only one question remains. Who will be held accountable? A child is gone. Not from illness, not from accident, but from something far darker: human cruelty. Now there are no more secrets. No more closed doors. Only the truth, laid bare on an autopsy table, in an interrogation room, and in a courtroom where justice will be demanded. But the question remains, will it be served? The medical examiner knew within minutes. This was not a natural death. Rica Rountree's body told a story of suffering, of violence, of a battle she never stood a chance of winning. The official cause of death: blunt force trauma to the abdomen, leading to a ruptured intestine and internal bleeding. But the damage wasn't just from that final blow. Rica's body bore the marks of prolonged, systematic abuse. Her ribs, bruised. Her arms, covered in old and new scars. X-rays revealed fractures, some fresh, some already healed. Injuries that no one had ever treated, injuries she was forced to endure in silence. The forensic team made one thing chillingly clear: Rica didn't die in one night of violence. She had been dying slowly over weeks, months. A child whose body had been breaking long before it finally gave out. And now the people responsible would have to answer for it. The evidence was undeniable. The police wasted no time. Cynthia Baker was the first to be arrested. The woman who had tormented Rica, who had treated her like she was nothing more than an object to be broken, was placed in handcuffs. Her charge? First-degree murder, aggravated battery of a child, and endangering the welfare of a minor. But what about Richard Rountree? The man who lived under the same roof? The man who ignored every warning sign, who stood by as his own daughter suffered. His arrest followed soon after. His charge? Child endangerment. A charge that, compared to what Rica had suffered, almost felt insufficient. Interrogation footage shows Cynthia Baker, unbothered, detached as she's questioned. No remorse. No tears. Just cold, calculated answers. Richard, on the other hand, crumbles. He claims he didn't know. That he never saw the signs. That he never realized the extent of what was happening. But the evidence, Those videos, those bruises, those reports, told a different story. Now it was time for justice to speak. The courtroom was silent when the trial began. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone had seen the reports. Everyone had heard the horror. But no one was prepared for the moment they would see it. The prosecution didn't just tell Rica's story. They showed it. One by one, the videos taken from Cynthia Baker's phone were played. The footage of Rica forced into stress positions. Rica being kicked in the stomach. Rica standing still while insults were thrown at her like knives. The courtroom wasn't just watching a case. They were watching a child be tortured, again and again. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. People turned away, unable to watch. One juror wiped their eyes. Another clenched their fists. Rica's mother sat frozen, her face twisted in anguish, as she was forced to see what had happened to the daughter she fought so hard to save. And yet, as the videos played, Cynthia Baker sat there, expressionless. No tears. No guilt. Just empty eyes staring forward. The prosecution called medical experts to the stand, detailing the extent of Rica's injuries. A forensic pathologist walked through each wound, each fracture, explaining in detail how Rica's body had suffered over time. Then came the emotional testimonies. Teachers who had noticed the bruises. Neighbors who had heard the screams. Investigators who had seen crime scenes before, but never something this cruel. The defense tried. They argued that Cynthia never meant to kill Rica, that she was just disciplining her, that it wasn't torture but strict parenting. But the evidence was too overwhelming. There was no explanation that could erase what everyone had seen. And then came the final moment, the sentencing. The judge's voice was steady, unwavering. The courtroom held its breath as the verdict was read. Cynthia Baker, guilty on all charges. Sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no outburst. No pleading. No final words of regret. Just silence. And then Rica Rountree's sentencing. 8 years in prison for child endangerment. A sentence that many felt was far too light for a father who had failed his own daughter in the worst way possible. As the courtroom emptied, Rica's mother, Anne, remained seated. Tears in her eyes. Justice had been served, but it wasn't enough. Because no amount of prison time would bring back her daughter. No amount of punishment would undo what had been done. Outside the courthouse, the public responded. People demanded change. Stricter laws. Better protections for children like Rica. But those calls for justice would never bring back the little girl who had needed saving before it was too late. And so, Rica's story does not end with a trial. It does not end with a sentencing. It ends with a question. A question every person who hears her story must ask themselves. How many more children will suffer before we finally listen? The trial is over. The verdict has been delivered. The people responsible for Rica Rountree's suffering have been sentenced. But justice, in the truest sense, can never be served. Because Rica is still gone. And the world that allowed her to suffer? It still exists. The question now is, will anything change? The days following Rica's death felt unreal to those who had loved her. In her school, an empty desk stood as a painful reminder of a little girl who should have been sitting there, laughing with her classmates, raising her hand with excitement. Instead, her name became a whispered tragedy. A lesson in loss that no child should have to learn. Her friends, too young to fully understand, asked when she would be coming back. Teachers, once helpless to stop the signs they had seen, wept in the halls, haunted by the what-ifs. What if they had pushed harder? What if they had done more? What if? But no one felt the loss more than her mother, Anne Rountree. A mother who had fought, who had screamed into a system that refused to listen. A mother who now stood over a tiny casket, saying goodbye to the daughter she had tried so hard to save. In an interview after the trial, and spoke through tears. She was the kindest, sweetest soul. She didn't deserve any of this. She was just a little girl. My little girl. Her words echoed in the hearts of many. And for the first time, people started to ask the right questions. Not just about Cynthia Baker, not just about Rica Rountree, but about the system that had let Rica slip through the cracks. The Department of Children and Family Services had received reports. Warnings. Multiple cries for help. And yet, Rica was left in the very home that would kill her. How does something like that happen? Experts in child welfare took a hard look at the system that was meant to protect children like Rica. What they found was disturbing. Caseworkers overwhelmed with too many cases, stretched thin, missing crucial warning signs. Laws that made it difficult to remove a child from their home without undeniable proof that often came too late. A legal system that prioritized reunification, even in homes where danger lurked in the shadows. And worst of all, Rica wasn't the only one. There were other names, other children, other stories, all strikingly similar. Reports made, red flags ignored, and then, tragedy, like Gabriel Fernandez, like Adrian Jones, like too many others. Rica's death was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger disease. A system built to protect, but one that too often fails when it matters most. In the wake of Rica's case, legal reforms were proposed. Stricter policies on child abuse investigations. Harsher penalties for parents and guardians who knowingly enable abuse. Calls for more funding, better training, and more urgency when a child's life is at risk. But would it be enough? Would change come in time to save the next Rica Rountree? There is a moment that haunts everyone who hears Rica's story. A moment when someone, anyone, could have changed the outcome. The teacher who noticed the bruises. The neighbor who heard the screaming. The caseworker who had the power to remove her from that home. The father who could have protected her. The question isn't just whether Rica could have been saved. The question is, why wasn't she? One act of courage. One decision. One person stepping forward at the right time. That's all it would have taken. And yet it didn't happen. So where does the blame lie? With the system? With the individuals who looked away? With a society that too often ignores the silent suffering of its most vulnerable? Maybe the blame is shared. Maybe we all carry a piece of it. The truth is, children like Rica don't always scream for help. Sometimes their cries are in the form of silence. In the way their eyes no longer shine. In the way they stop playing, stop laughing, stop believing the world is good. And when we see those signs, we have two choices: to act or to turn away. For Rica, too many people turned away. But maybe, just maybe, her story can change that. Maybe the next time someone will see the signs and speak up. Maybe the next time the system will act faster. Maybe the next time a child like Rica will be saved. Because if there is one thing we must take away from this story, it is this: there cannot be another Rica Rountree. In the end, Rica's story is not just one of loss. It is a reminder, a warning, and above all, a call to action. She was not just a name in a news report. She was not just a victim. She was a little girl. A little girl who should have been protected. A little girl who should still be here. Her story is painful. But pain fades. Stories are forgotten. And that is why we must remember. Because the moment we forget Rica Rountree, the moment we let her name become just another headline, is the moment we allow it to happen again. And we can't let that happen. Rica Rountree's story is heartbreaking. But it is also a reminder. A reminder that we must do better. That we must speak up. That we must never turn a blind eye when a child is suffering. But this is just one story. There are more. There are countless other voices that need to be heard. And that's why we are here, to tell these stories, to spread awareness, to make sure that no victim is forgotten. If this documentary moved you, if Rica's story impacted you, then I ask you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel. Be part of a community that refuses to stay silent. A community that fights for justice, that brings awareness to the stories that need to be told. Together we can shine a light on the darkness and maybe, just maybe, prevent the next tragedy. To those who have already subscribed, thank you. Your support means more than you know. You are not just watching, you are making a difference. You are amplifying voices that might have otherwise been lost. But this mission isn't over. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Share this video. Help us spread awareness. Because awareness leads to action. And action can save lives. Rica Rountree deserved better. Let's make sure the next child gets it. Subscribe now. Be the voice that makes a difference.